The virgin slave boy was forced to take the master's place on the wedding night, but what happened in that chamber wasn't what anyone expected, and it would destroy an empire built on power, hierarchy, and control. For one night, the invisible became visible. For one night, the powerless held everything in his hands, but the real cost of that single night, it was only just beginning. This is the story of how one moment of impossible choice shattered 3 lives forever. In a world where blood determined destiny, Demon was less than blood. He was the mistake no one spoke of, a slave so deeply woven into the fabric of servitude that most people looked through him rather than at him. He'd been born in the servants' quarters of the Blackstone estate, the son of a kitchen maid and a man whose name his mother refused to say. From the moment he could walk, Demon understood one brutal truth: he owned nothing. Not his time, not his body, not even his own breath. Everything belonged to Lord Blackstone. The estate was a monument to power. Sprawling gardens manicured to perfection, stone walls that stretched toward the sky like prison bars, and rooms so numerous that Demon had never seen them all despite living there his entire 19 years. But power, real power, wasn't in the architecture. It was in the eyes of the man who ruled it all. Lord Blackstone controlled everything with mathematical precision. His word was law. His reputation was currency. His will was the only will that mattered. And servants like Demon, they were just parts of the machinery that kept that empire turning. Demon moved through those halls like a ghost. Early mornings hauling water, afternoons preparing meals he would never eat, evenings cleaning rooms he would never sleep in. His hands were calloused, his back perpetually bent. His eyes learned to stay downcast, not from shame, but from survival. A slave who looked a master in the eye was a slave asking for punishment. But Demon had learned to see things without looking. In the shadows, in the periphery, he observed everything. He watched how Lord Blackstone moved through his domain with absolute certainty, how servants scattered like insects when he approached, how power wasn't just about authority. It was about the fear that authority inspired. And he watched Lady Catherine. She arrived 3 weeks before the wedding, sent from a neighboring house as part of a strategic alliance between families. Demon first saw her descending from the carriage dressed in fabric so fine it seemed to catch the light itself. Her face was beautiful in the way porcelain is beautiful, perfect, polished, and utterly fragile. But it was her eyes that struck him. Even from a distance, even trying to be invisible, Demon could see the despair in them. She looked at the estate, her future prison, the way a bird looks at a cage it can never escape. The wedding was 3 weeks away, and it consumed everything. Lord Blackstone, transformed. The careful control that defined him became obsessive. Every detail had to be flawless. Every servant had to move with precision. The grounds were inspected daily. The kitchens worked until midnight. Demon found himself working longer hours, moving faster, his shoulders bearing more weight than before. But this wasn't just about a wedding. This was about power. The marriage wasn't a love match. It was a consolidation of wealth and influence. Lady Catherine's family was rich but declining. Lord Blackstone's family was powerful but needed fresh capital. The union would cement both families at the apex of society. It was calculated. It was strategic. It was everything that mattered in their world. And it was suffocating. Demon watched Lady Catherine move through the estate like a condemned woman awaiting execution. She spoke little. She smiled when required, and nothing more. When she thought no one was looking, when she believed herself truly alone, her face would collapse into something raw and desperate. One afternoon, Demon was cleaning the library when she entered, unaware of his presence. She stood at the window overlooking the gardens, her hand pressed against the glass, and he heard her whisper something so quietly he almost missed it. "I will die in this place." It wasn't a statement of fact. It was a prayer, a plea, a woman staring into the abyss of her own future and seeing nothing but darkness. Demon should have looked away, should have made himself invisible even to his own conscience, but something in her despair reached through the distance between them and touched something he didn't know he possessed. Empathy for another person trapped in a world not of their choosing. For a slave boy who owned nothing, including hope, this was dangerous. The week before the wedding, Lord Blackstone held a celebration. Members of the nobility arrived from across the region. Musicians played in the great hall, wine flowed like water, and servants like Demon became even more invisible. Efficient ghosts moving through the rooms, ensuring everything was perfect while remaining utterly unseen. Demon watched from the shadows as Lady Catherine was paraded before the guests like a prize horse at auction. She wore a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She performed the role she'd been born to play, the gracious bride-to-be, honored to be joining such a prestigious family. Lord Blackstone stood beside her, one hand possessively at her waist, discussing with other lords the financial arrangements as if she couldn't hear every word, as if she wasn't a human being, but a transaction. And Demon, invisible in the corner with a serving tray, understood something fundamental. Power wasn't just about what you could do, it was about what you could take away from someone else. Lady Catherine had lost everything the moment she was born. Her choice, her freedom, her future. All of it belonged to the men in that room. He belonged to no one any less. But at least he had no illusions about his place. But tomorrow would bring a crisis that no amount of planning could prevent, and it would force Lord Blackstone to make a choice that would shatter the carefully constructed hierarchy of the Blackstone estate forever. The night before the wedding, Lord Blackstone collapsed. It happened during dinner. One moment he was discussing the final arrangements with the wedding coordinator, his voice commanding, his posture rigid with authority. The next moment his hand trembled. His face went pale. He gripped the table's edge as if the world was tilting beneath him. "I'm fine," he insisted, even as sweat beaded on his forehead. "Just exhaustion. The preparations have been—" But he wasn't fine. Within the hour he was fevered. Within 2 hours he couldn't stand without assistance. By midnight he was delirious, calling out names of people long dead, his body burning as if possessed by something unseen. The physician was summoned. He arrived with his leather bag and his stern expression, examined the lord in his private chambers, and emerged with a diagnosis that fell like a stone into still water. Severe fever. Possibly pneumonia. Possibly worse. Rest was essential. Absolute rest. And there was no guarantee he would recover by tomorrow. No guarantee. Those 3 words hung in the air like a death sentence. Because Lord Blackstone didn't get sick. Lord Blackstone didn't have weaknesses. Lord Blackstone was the immovable force around which the entire estate, the entire region, organized itself. The thought that he might be vulnerable was almost incomprehensible. And the wedding was in 18 hours. Panic rippled through the estate like a disease spreading through flesh. The guests were already arriving, lords and ladies in their finest garments, expecting the social event of the season. The kitchens had prepared enough food for 300 people. The great hall was decorated with flowers, otu imported from across the kingdom. Musicians were tuning their instruments. Everything was in motion, a massive machine that could not simply stop. But the groom was dying. Lady Catherine's reaction was impossible to read. Demon watched her from his position in the shadows, always watching, always invisible, and saw something flicker across her face that might have been fear or might have been hope. She stood in the corridor outside Lord Blackstone's chambers, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles went white. "Will he recover in time?" she asked the physician, her voice steady but her eyes betraying her. "I cannot say, my lady. Fevers like this. They are unpredictable." The servants began whispering. Some thought it was a sign from God. Others wondered if the marriage was cursed. But the practical reality was simpler and more brutal. If Lord Blackstone couldn't be present at his own wedding, it would be a scandal, a humiliation. His reputation, the foundation of his power, would crumble. And more than that, the contract between the families required the consummation of the marriage to be verified. There were witnesses who would need to confirm that the wedding night had been properly concluded. Without that proof, the alliance could be contested. Everything would unravel. Demon moved through the corridors hearing fragments of conversation. The anxiety was almost a physical thing, pressing against the walls, suffocating everyone in its grip. Lord Blackstone's advisor, a thin man named Merrick with eyes like a calculating machine, began tallying options. The wedding could be postponed, but that would require notification of all the guests, a humiliation that would take days to explain. The wedding could proceed with a substitute, but no one was of sufficient rank to stand in for the Lord. By midnight, as Demon hauled water to the Lord's chamber to cool his fevered skin, Merrick was in the corridor with Lord Blackstone's steward, and there, conversation stopped Demon cold. "There is no acceptable solution," Merrick was saying. Unless what?" the steward demanded. "Unless someone stood in for him. Someone the bride wouldn't immediately recognize as an impostor. Someone with enough physical similarity to—" "You're mad. It's impossible." "Is it? The bride has never seen Lord Blackstone in daylight. She's been kept in the guest quarters. The wedding night is darkness and ceremony and wine. If someone entered that chamber dressed in his garments, moving with authority, speaking in measured tones, the bride would know immediately. Would she? Or would she see what she expects to see? A man in her husband's clothing, in her husband's chambers, on her husband's wedding night. What else would she see?" Demon understood in that moment that he was listening to something that could destroy him. That knowledge was a weapon in this world, and weapons in the hands of slaves were always turned inward. He should have left, should have made himself truly invisible by simply not hearing, but he stayed. An hour later, Demon was summoned to Lord Blackstone's private study. Merrick was waiting, along with the steward and, shockingly, Lord Blackstone himself, wrapped in a robe, moving like a man barely tethered to consciousness. "You," Lord Blackstone said, his voice rough and barely above a whisper. "Your name. What is it?" "Demon, my lord." "Age?" 19, my lord." "Height, build, physical characteristics." Demon answered each question mechanically, understanding nothing except that he was being evaluated like a horse at auction. Lord Blackstone studied him with fever-bright eyes, and Demon could see the calculations happening behind that gaze. "It could work," Merrick said quietly. "The darkness, the ceremony, the wine, they'll both be given. The bride won't know. The witnesses will see what they expect to see. By morning, the contract is consummated, the alliance is sealed, and Lord Blackstone recovers in privacy." "And if she recognizes the deception?" the steward asked. "Then we deny everything," Merrick said flatly. "Who will believe a bride over the word of a lord? She'll be dismissed as confused, or mad, or lying. Her family won't press the issue because their alliance depends on this marriage remaining intact." Demon felt something cold move through his chest. This wasn't just a plan. It was a conspiracy, a violation, a crime wrapped in practicality, and he was standing in the center of it. Lord Blackstone leaned forward, his fevered eyes boring into Demon's. "You will take my place on the wedding night," he said, and it wasn't a request. "You will enter that chamber. You will consummate this marriage. You will then return to your quarters and speak of this to no one. If you succeed, you will be rewarded. If you fail, if you speak, if you hesitate, if you do anything other than exactly as instructed, you will be executed. Do you understand?" Every Betsy-Dord instinct in Demon screamed to refuse, to run, to find some way to warn Lady Catherine. But he was a slave. Refusal wasn't an option. "Yes, my lord," he whispered. "Good," Lord Blackstone said, and then he collapsed back into his pillows, unconscious. And Demon understood with crystalline clarity that his entire life had just fractured into before and after. Everything he had been was irrelevant. Everything he would become was terrifying. He had been invisible for 19 years. Tomorrow night he would have to become someone else entirely. But neither Lord Blackstone nor Merrick nor anyone else in that room understood what would truly happen when a slave boy stepped into a chamber meant for a lord, and faced a woman who was far more than the fragile porcelain she appeared to be. The wedding day arrived like a guillotine's blade. Demon moved through the morning in a state of fractured consciousness. His hands performed their duties, bringing water, preparing food, cleaning, corridors, but his mind existed somewhere else entirely. A place where terror and impossibility collided, where every heartbeat felt like a countdown to execution. The estate transformed. Flowers adorned every surface. Musicians began their rehearsals. Servants rushed about with final preparations while nobility arrived in carriages that gleamed like polished weapons. The air itself seemed charged with anticipation, with the electricity of a moment that would be recorded in the annals of family history. And Demon was at the center of it, invisible as always, carrying the weight of a secret that could shatter kingdoms. By afternoon, he was summoned to a private chamber. Merrick was waiting with clothing, Lord Blackstone's wedding night garments, expensive silk, fine embroidery, the uniform of power. "You will dress in these at midnight," Merrick instructed, his voice devoid of emotion. "You will be taken through the servants' passages to the Lord's chambers. You will wait in darkness. When the bride enters, you will move slowly, deliberately. Speak only if absolutely necessary. Keep your face turned away from direct light. The rest will follow naturally." "What if she—" Demon started, but Merrick cut him off with a look sharp enough to draw blood. "She won't. Women like her are trained from birth to be objects, not observers. She will see the title, not the man. She will feel the authority, not the person. Do you understand?" Demon nodded, though he understood nothing except that he was about to commit a violation that would haunt him forever. The wedding itself was performed in the great hall, with Lord Blackstone's steward offering apologies for the Lord's absence. A sudden illness, regrettable. But the ceremony would proceed. The marriage would be sealed, and the Lord would join them for the consummation later that evening. It was a lie woven so smoothly into the fabric of tradition that no one questioned it. Demon watched from the kitchen corridor as Lady Catherine walked down the aisle in a dress that must have cost more than his entire life's worth. She moved like a woman walking to her execution, each step measured and precise. Her face was composed, her expression carefully neutral, but Demon could see the tremor in her hands as she reached the altar. She was terrified, and in a few hours she would discover that her terror was only beginning. The wedding feast was a performance of celebration that felt obscene. Music and laughter echoed through the great hall. Wine flowed endlessly. Toasts were made to the happy couple, or rather to Lady Catherine, since her groom remained conspicuously absent. The guests were informed he was resting, gathering strength for the evening's festivities. Everyone accepted this explanation because it was easier than questioning the narrative being presented to them. Demon served wine and cleared plates while watching Lady Catherine sit at the head table, smiling her porcelain. Smile, playing the role she'd been cast in since birth. But he could see the cracks now. The slight tremor when she lifted her glass. The way her eyes kept darting toward the doors, searching for something, or someone, that never appeared. At one point, her mother, a severe woman with iron-gray hair, leaned over and whispered something in her ear. Lady Catherine's face went even paler. Her mother's expression was cold, matter-of-fact, a reminder of duty, a warning about what was to come. The consumption of the wedding night wasn't optional. It was a necessity, a confirmation, a proof that the marriage was real and binding and forever. As midnight approached, Demon felt something shifting inside him. The terror was still there, but beneath it, or perhaps woven through it, was a strange kind of clarity. He was about to become someone else, not through choice, but through circumstance. For one night, the invisible slave boy would wear the mask of power itself. He dressed in Lord Blackstone's garments in a small servant's chamber off the main corridor. The fabric felt foreign against his skin, as if it might burn him. In the mirror, a luxury slaves never saw themselves in, a stranger looked back at him. Someone with a lord's clothes but a slave's haunted eyes. Merrick appeared, moved him through the darkened passages like a piece on a chessboard, and left him in Lord Blackstone's private chambers with instructions whispered so quietly they felt like poison. She will enter through that door. You will be in shadow. Let her adjust to the darkness. Let her make assumptions. Let her fear do the work for you. The consummation must be real enough that there's no question of its occurrence. The witnesses will hear sounds, will confirm what they expect to confirm. You understand? Demon understood. He understood that he was being asked to commit rape disguised as marriage. He understood that consent had no meaning in this world, that Lady Catherine's body belonged to Lord Blackstone regardless of her will. He understood that his own body, his own humanity, had never belonged to himself at all. He understood that he was about to do something that would change both of them forever. When Merrick left, Demon stood alone in the darkness of Lord Blackstone's chambers, and for the first time in his life, he made a choice that was truly his own. Lady Catherine entered an hour later, escorted by her mother and a handful of older women who performed the traditional rituals. They removed her outer garments, left her in the delicate nightgown that had been prepared for this moment, and whispered their final instructions. Words about duty and obligation and the importance of producing heirs. When they left, closing the heavy door behind them, there was only silence. Demon stood in the shadows, barely breathing, watching as Lady Catherine's eyes adjusted to the darkness. She could see him, barely, a figure in Lord Blackstone's silhouette, standing, motionless, as if waiting. "My lord," she whispered, and her voice carried such a weight of resignation that it broke something in him. He didn't speak, couldn't speak. The words would have betrayed him immediately. She moved toward him slowly, her hands trembling. In the darkness, she truly did see only what she expected to see: the shape of power, the form of her fate, the physical embodiment of the life she had been sold into. She stood before him, tears running silently down her cheeks, and waited for what came next. And Demon, standing in stolen clothes, living a stolen moment, wearing a stolen identity, made the second choice of his life that was truly his own. He stepped backward, just slightly, and whispered one sentence that violated every instruction he'd been given. "I am not him." For a moment, there was only absolute silence. Then Lady Catherine's breath caught, and she stepped forward, her eyes searching his face in the darkness, trying to understand. "What?" she breathed. "I am not Lord Blackstone. My name is Demon. I am a slave, and I cannot do what they've asked me to do." He expected her to scream, to call for the guards, to expose him immediately. Instead, she stepped closer, studying his face in the darkness, and whispered something that changed everything. "Then what will we do?" Because in that moment, in the darkness of a chamber meant for violation and deception, two people who owned nothing, not their bodies, not their futures, not even their own names, made a choice that would tear apart the world that had created them. And by morning, nothing would ever be the same. What will we do? Those 4 words hung in the darkness like a prayer answered by the wrong God. Lady Catherine stood before him, her nightgown pale against the shadows, her eyes searching his face with an intensity that made Demon feel truly seen for the first time in his life. He had no answer. His mind was still reeling from the fact that he hadn't been immediately betrayed, that she hadn't screamed, that instead of rejection, he'd encountered something far more dangerous. Curiosity. "I don't know," he admitted, and the honesty of it felt like stepping off a cliff. "I was ordered to consummate the marriage without your knowledge, to deceive you, to—" "I know what you were ordered to do," Lady Catherine interrupted, her voice surprisingly steady. She turned away from him, moving to the window, her silhouette framed against the faint moonlight. "Lord Blackstone's adviser explained it to my mother. He asked her permission to substitute a servant because my husband was ill. He promised it would be undetectable. He assured her that my honor would remain intact because I would believe my husband had come to me." Demon felt the world tilt beneath him. "Your mother knew?" "My mother has been negotiating the terms of my imprisonment since the moment I was born," Lady Catherine said, and there was a bitterness in her voice that cut like a blade. "She didn't care who consummates the marriage as long as the contract is sealed and the alliance is secured. To her, I am a transaction. My body is currency. My will is irrelevant." She turned back to face him, and in the moonlight, Demon could see her more clearly now. Not the porcelain bride from the ceremony. This was a different woman. Harder, sharper, more real. "But you told me," she continued. "You broke your instructions. You risked execution to tell me the truth. Why?" Demon opened his mouth, then closed it, because he didn't know why, or rather, he knew 1,000 reasons, and they all felt insufficient, because her despair had touched him, because her mother had crushed her spirit and he couldn't be another instrument of that crushing, because for 19 years he had been invisible, and the thought of violating someone else's invisibility, their will, their choice, their humanity, was suddenly unbearable. Because it was wrong. He finally said. Lady Catherine studied him for a long moment, and something shifted in her expression, something that looked like recognition. "My name is Catherine," she said quietly. "Not Lady Catherine, just Catherine. I don't think anyone has asked me my name in years." "Catherine," he repeated, and the word felt sacred in his mouth. "What happens now, Demon?" The answer, they both realized immediately, was terrifyingly simple. They had to make it seem like the consummation had occurred, while ensuring that it actually hadn't. The witnesses would be listening from the adjoining chamber. They would hear sounds, they would expect evidence. They would report back to Merrick and Lord Blackstone that the deed had been done. And then what? Then Demon would return to the servants' quarters, Catherine would return to her role as dutiful bride, and they would both live with the secret for the rest of their lives. It was impossible. It was also the only option available to them. They spent the next hour in frantic, whispered conversation. Catherine moved about the chamber, gathering pillows, blankets, constructing a nest on the bed that would account for movement and activity. She found a small vial of her own blood from her monthly courses, kept for exactly this purpose as proof of her virginity, and they placed it strategically on the sheets. "We need sounds," Catherine said, her mind working with a clarity that surprised them both. "They're listening. They'll expect—" She paused, her cheeks flushing slightly. "They'll expect to hear evidence of physical exertion, of struggle, of—" "I understand," Demon said gently. They worked together, creating a performance. Catherine would speak in a low voice as if in pain or pleasure. She would vary it, keep it ambiguous. Demon would move the bed slightly, creating sounds of activity. They rehearsed it like actors preparing for the most important role of their lives. But as they worked, something else happened. They talked. Catherine told him about her childhood, raised by a mother who saw her only as a means to an end. About the governess who taught her to read in secret, because educated women were dangerous. About the books hidden beneath her mattress, filled with stories of women who had lives of their own. About the desperate, suffocating knowledge that everything about her belonged to someone else. Demon told her about being born into servitude, about learning to make himself small so he wouldn't be noticed, about watching power destroy people from the shadows, about the moment she arrived at the estate, and he realized that even in a world of hierarchy and control, some people suffered more than others. "We're both slaves," Catherine whispered at one point. "Just different kinds." "Yes," Demon agreed, "but your chains are prettier." She laughed. A real laugh, not the careful social performance he'd seen before, and the sound was like a door opening onto a world that had seemed permanently closed. As midnight turned to the early hours of morning, they lay on the bed, fully clothed, speaking in whispers, and Demon realized something that terrified him. He was falling in love with this woman, not because of her beauty or her station, but because she was the first person who had ever treated him like a human being, like someone who mattered, like someone worth the risk of truth. And she was looking at him with an expression that suggested she might be feeling something similar. "What happens after tonight?" Catherine asked softly. "What happens when dawn comes and they demand proof and we have to go back to being invisible?" "I don't know," Demon admitted, "but we'll figure it out, together." "Together," she repeated, and reached out to take his hand in the darkness. At dawn, there was a careful knock on the chamber door. Merrick's voice came through, professional and detached. "My lord, the witnesses require confirmation of the night's success." Demon and Catherine exchanged a look, a moment of perfect understanding, and then Catherine called out in a voice heavy with false emotion, "Tell them it is done. Tell them Lord Blackstone is resting now. Tell them the alliance is sealed." There was a pause. Then Merrick's voice again. "Very well. I will inform the families." They waited until his footsteps faded, until the house began to stir with the sounds of mourning, until it became clear that they had succeeded. The deception had held. The witnesses had heard what they expected to hear. The evidence was sufficient. The contract was consummated. But as Demon moved toward the door to leave, to return to the servants' quarters and resume his invisible life, Catherine grabbed his hand. "Don't go yet," she whispered. "Just stay for a moment longer." He stayed. Of course he stayed. And in those final minutes before discovery became impossible, they held each other in the early morning light, two people who had been taught their entire lives that they were disposable, allowing themselves to believe, for just a moment, that they mattered, that they were worth saving, that love could exist in a world built on hierarchy and control. But the moment Demon stepped into the corridor, he realized something that made his blood run cold. Lord Blackstone's steward was waiting for him, and his expression suggested he knew exactly what had happened. And what came next wouldn't be forgiveness or reward. It would be far, far worse. The steward's eyes were cold, the eyes of a man who had witnessed everything and judged nothing, because judgment required caring about something beyond his own survival. "Come with me," he said quietly, gesturing down the corridor away from Lord Blackstone's chambers. Demon's heart seized. This was it, the discovery, the execution, everything he'd feared since the moment Merrick had first summoned him to that study where his life had fractured into before and after. But the steward didn't lead him toward the dungeons where prisoners were kept in darkness and chains. He didn't take him to the courtyard where public punishments occurred, where slaves were made examples of in front of the entire household. Instead, he led him through the servants' passages, the hidden arteries of the estate that slaves moved through like blood cells, unseen and forgotten, to a small private chamber that Demon had never encountered before. Inside, Lord Blackstone was waiting. The Lord was still fevered, still weak, but his eyes burned with an intensity that made him seem even more dangerous in his vulnerability. He sat in a high-backed chair near the window, wrapped in a robe of deep burgundy, and gestured for Demon to enter with a movement so subtle it was almost imperceptible. "Close the door," he commanded, his voice barely more than a whisper. Demon obeyed, his mind fragmenting into 1,000 scenarios, each one more horrifying than the last. Execution in the courtyard, torture in the dungeons, being sent away to the mines where slaves were worked to death, being publicly whipped as an example to others. Each possibility branched into further horrors, a tree of endings that all led to the same destination: death. Lord Blackstone studied him for a long moment, and the silence stretched between them like a living thing. Demon could hear his own heartbeat, could feel sweat beginning to bead on his forehead, could sense the steward's presence behind him like a shadow waiting to pounce. When Lord Blackstone finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, which somehow made it more terrifying than any shout could have been. "The steward informed me that you deviated from your instructions last night, that you spoke to the bride, that you broke the most fundamental rule of your servitude, absolute obedience." Demon said nothing. There was nothing to say. The truth would condemn him. A lie would be insulting to a man who clearly already knew everything. Denial would be beneath the dignity of this moment. He simply stood, waiting for the judgment that would determine whether he lived or died. "He also informed me," Lord Blackstone continued, his eyes never leaving Demon's face, "that despite this deviation, the night was successful, that the witnesses heard what they expected to hear, that the contract was consummated, that the alliance remains intact, that no one suspects anything is amiss." Still silence. "Which means," the Lord said slowly, enunciating each word as if speaking to someone who didn't understand the language, "that you not only disobeyed a direct command, you also managed to salvage the situation despite that disobedience. You found a way to make it work. You showed initiative, resourcefulness, intelligence." Demon raised his eyes slightly, searching for the trap in these words. Because there had to be a trap. There was always a trap. Nothing in the world of power could be straightforward. "That is, an unexpected skill in a slave," Lord Blackstone said. And there was something almost like admiration in his voice, which was somehow more terrifying than anger would have been. Most would have either followed orders blindly, fulfilling them without question, becoming merely an instrument of another's will, or they would have panicked, exposed the entire scheme, brought everything crashing down. You did neither. You thought, you adapted, you succeeded, you found a third way where none should have existed. He leaned back in his chair slightly, his fever-bright eyes never wavering from Demon's. "That is either the mark of an exceptional slave, or the sign of someone who shouldn't be a slave at all. I haven't yet decided which." "My lord, Demon started, but Lord Blackstone held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "I don't want your explanation. I don't want your apologies or your justifications. I want to know what you want." The question was so unexpected that Demon almost didn't comprehend it. His mind had been so focused on survival, on waiting for the inevitable punishment, that he hadn't prepared for this. "My lord." "You risked execution to tell the bride the truth," Lord Blackstone continued, his voice taking on an almost conversational tone, as if they were two gentlemen discussing philosophy over wine rather than a slave facing judgment. "You risked everything to warn her, to inform her, to treat her as though her opinion mattered. That suggests you wanted something other than simple obedience. That suggests you wanted her consent, her understanding, her— what? Agreement, complicity, partnership? What did you want from her? And here, in this moment, with everything balanced on the edge of a knife, with the steward standing behind him and the Lord seated before him and the entire future of his life hanging in the balance, Demon made a choice. He could lie. He could invent some convenient motivation that would satisfy a lord's understanding of the world. A story about duty to the household, or concern for the alliance, or some other practical concern that would make sense within the hierarchy of power. He could protect himself by saying what needed to be said. He could live. Instead, he told the truth. "I wanted her to know who was in that chamber," Demon said quietly, his voice steady despite the terror that was threatening to overwhelm him. I didn't want her to be violated by a stranger wearing another man's clothes. I didn't want her to spend the rest of her life believing a lie about the most intimate moment of her existence. I wanted her to choose, even if her only choices were terrible ones. Lord Blackstone's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. A flicker of recognition, perhaps, or understanding, or something even more complex. It was the look of a man encountering an idea he'd never seriously considered before. "You wanted her to have agency," the Lord said softly, as if testing the words to see how they felt, in his mouth. "In a world where agency is a privilege reserved for men of my station, you wanted a woman of considerably higher birth than you, a woman trained from birth to be an ornament and a vessel for heirs, to have the ability to choose her own violation." "Yes, my lord." "That is either incredibly noble or incredibly foolish," Lord Blackstone said, and there was something almost like wonder in his voice. "I haven't yet decided which. Perhaps it's both. Perhaps nobility and foolishness are simply different perspectives on the same action." He gestured slightly with one hand, a movement so minute that Demon almost missed it. "You may sit," the Lord said, nodding toward a low stool near the window. Demon sat, the action feeling surreal. A slave being invited to sit in the presence of his master was so unusual that it seemed to violate the laws of nature itself. "Tell me about her," Lord Blackstone said. "Tell me about the bride. What is she like? What did you discover? In those hours, in the darkness?" And so Demon found himself talking, really talking, for the first time in his life. He described Catherine's fear and her courage, her intelligence masked beneath layers of social conditioning, the way her mind worked, quick and sharp and capable of seeing through pretense, her desperate hunger for something beyond the life she'd been assigned, her capacity for hope. Lord Blackstone listened without interrupting, his fevered eyes never leaving Demon's face. When Demon finally fell silent, the Lord nodded slowly. "You understand what you've done, don't you?" Lord Blackstone asked after a long moment of silence. "You've created a complication. The bride now knows the truth. She knows that the consummation was a deception. She knows that you risked your life, risked execution for her consent. She knows that there is at least one person in this estate who values her humanity." "Yes, my lord." "That makes her dangerous," the Lord continued, and his voice took on a harder edge. "Not to me. My position is secure, my power is absolute, nothing she does can truly threaten me. But to you, to herself. Because now she'll begin to imagine possibilities that shouldn't exist in her world. She'll begin to believe that she has choices, that her life could be different, that there might be a way out of the cage I've built for her, that maybe, just maybe, the rigid structure of power that defines our world isn't as immovable as it appears." Demon felt something cold settle in his chest like a stone dropped into still water. He had given Catherine hope, and hope was the most dangerous gift of all, not because it brought happiness, but because it brought the possibility of disappointment, the awareness of what could be, the knowledge that the world could be different, which made the actual world seem unbearably cruel by comparison. "I could have you executed," Lord Blackstone said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "It would be simple, efficient. A slave who disobeyed a direct command, who endangered a strategic alliance, who took it upon himself to grant agency to someone he had no right to grant anything to. The magistrate would approve it. The other lords would applaud it. The household would be reminded of the consequences of disobedience. It would be justice. It would be necessary. It would restore the order you disrupted." He paused, letting the weight of these words settle over Demon like a shroud. The implications of execution, the pain of it, the shame of it, the final erasure of his existence, hung in the air between them. "But I won't," Lord Blackstone said finally, and his voice carried a strange note of, "What? Mercy? Curiosity? Something else entirely?" Demon's breath caught in his throat, trapped between hope and terror. "Because I'm curious," the Lord continued, leaning forward slightly in his chair. "I'm curious what happens when a slave and his master's bride discover they have more in common with each other than either has with the men who own them. I'm curious whether love, or whatever you want to call what's clearly developing between you, is stronger than the systems that bind you both. I'm curious whether hope is truly as dangerous as I believe it to be, or whether it's simply another illusion I can shatter at will." He gestured toward the window where the morning light was beginning to break through the clouds. "I've spent my entire life studying power," Lord Blackstone said softly. "I've learned how to maintain it, how to consolidate it, how to wield it without appearing to wield it. I've learned that the secret to absolute power is understanding what people desire and then controlling their access to that desire. But I've never truly studied what happens when two people desire each other more than they desire survival. What happens when the bonds between two individuals become stronger than the bonds of fear and hierarchy. I want to know what happens in that scenario." He leaned back in his chair again, and a slight smile played at the corners of his mouth. "So, here is what will happen," Lord Blackstone said, and his voice took on the tone of a man laying out the rules of a game. "You will return to your duties. The bride will return to her role as my wife, and I will watch to see what you do with this impossible situation. I will be your silent observer, your hidden witness. Every choice you make, every risk you take, every moment you allow yourselves to believe in something beyond the hierarchy. I will see it. I will measure it. I will judge it." He paused, his expression growing darker, more dangerous. "If you attempt to escape, I will hunt you down and execute you publicly in the courtyard, where every servant and every visiting noble will see what happens to those who betray my trust. And I will execute her as well, slowly, so you have time to contemplate the consequences of your choices. If you attempt to tell anyone the truth about the wedding night, the same will occur. If you attempt to harm me or my reputation in any way, if you attempt to undermine my authority or question my power, I will destroy both of you. I will make your deaths legendary. I will ensure that your suffering becomes a cautionary tale told in servant quarters for generations." He leaned forward again, his fevered eyes burning with an intensity that was almost inhuman, almost like he was possessed by something darker and older than himself. "But if you navigate this situation with the same care and intelligence you showed last night, if you help me understand what happens when people begin to believe they have agency within a system designed to deny them that very thing, then I might let you live, both of you. I might even, and this is a concession I make to no one, I might even allow your relationship to continue, provided you never forget the boundaries that must remain unviolated." "Why would you do that, my lord?" Demon asked, his voice barely steady, the question escaping before he could stop it. "Because," Lord Blackstone said, "I am a student of power. And the greatest lesson about power is understanding how to maintain it when people begin to imagine they can escape. I've always maintained power through fear, through absolute control, through the certainty that resistance is futile. But perhaps there's another way. Perhaps I can maintain power by allowing people to believe they have freedom, while ensuring that their choices never actually threaten my authority. Perhaps the most exquisite form of control is giving people the illusion of agency, while keeping them forever bound." He gestured toward the door. "Go," he said simply. "Tell no one about this conversation. Continue your duties. Continue your relationship, for lack of a better word, and know that I am always watching, always observing, always waiting to see what you'll do next." Demon stood, his legs barely steady beneath him, and moved toward the door. But as his hand touched the handle, Lord Blackstone spoke again. "One more thing, Demon." He turned back. "What you did last night, choosing truth over obedience, agency over compliance, that took courage. real courage. The kind of courage that could change the world if given the opportunity. Don't lose that courage. I want to see what you'll do with it, because I suspect that before this is over, you might force me to make a choice as well, and I'm very curious about what choice I'll make. For the next 3 months, Demon lived a double life so carefully constructed that he sometimes forgot which version of himself was real. By day, he was the invisible slave, moving through the corridors of the estate, performing his duties with mechanical precision, speaking only when directly addressed, maintaining the careful posture of servitude that had kept him alive since birth. He carried water and cleared dishes and swept floors and fixed things that broke. He made himself small. He made himself forgettable. He made himself into exactly what the world expected him to be. But by night, in stolen moments scattered throughout the days like hidden treasures, a conversation in the library after the household had gone to sleep, a meeting in the gardens behind the rose bushes, a whispered exchange in the corridor between his duties and the next, he was something else entirely. He was a man. He was a person who mattered. He was the one person in Catherine's world who treated her as though she had a will of her own, as though her thoughts and feelings and desires were worth considering. Catherine transformed as well, in ways both subtle and profound. The porcelain bride, the careful, constrained woman who had walked down the aisle with her eyes downcast, became something harder, sharper, more dangerous. She began to read more openly. Leaving books casually on tables instead of hiding them beneath her mattress, she began to ask questions about the estate's operations, about finances and management, and the structure of power that held everything in place. She began to move through the rooms with a new kind of confidence, not the brittle, performative authority of a lady born to privilege, but the quiet authority of a woman who had discovered that her cage had doors if she knew where to look. The servants noticed first. Catherine's transformation couldn't remain invisible, no matter how careful she tried to be. They whispered in the kitchens, in the servant quarters, in the spaces between tasks. The lady was different. The lady was asking questions. The lady was spending time in places a lady shouldn't be. The lady was speaking to Demon more than could possibly be explained by coincidence. And if the servants noticed, it was only a matter of time before the visiting lords and ladies would notice as well. Demon began to see the looks they gave Catherine when they thought no one was watching, the speculative glances, the raised eyebrows, the conversations that stopped abruptly when he entered the room, whispers about whether the bride was truly obedient, questions about whether Lord Blackstone was losing control of his own household, suggestions that perhaps the strategic marriage hadn't been as successful as advertised. The power was being undermined, Demon realized, not by rebellion or conspiracy or direct challenge, but by something far more subtle and far more dangerous, the possibility that happiness existed within the Lord's domain, that a wife was beginning to live instead of merely existing, that a slave had been raised to the status of, what? Confidant? Companion? Something that shouldn't exist in the rigid hierarchy of their world. That genuine human connection could flourish even in the most carefully controlled environments. And as the whispers grew, as the speculation increased, as the balance of power began to shift in ways that were barely perceptible, but nonetheless real, Lord Blackstone watched. Demon could feel the Lord's gaze following them, in the halls, in the gardens, in the spaces between moments. The Lord was gathering data, making observations, understanding how love functioned when given even the smallest space to grow. 3 months to the day after the wedding night, as autumn turned toward winter and the estate began to prepare for the cold season, Lord Blackstone summoned them both to his private chambers. He was well now, fully recovered from his illness, his power restored to its full extent. The fever had broken weeks ago, and with it had come a kind of hardening, not of his body, but of his resolve. He moved with the confidence of a man who had faced his own mortality and emerged stronger for it. His expression, when they entered the chamber, suggested that the time for curiosity had ended, that the experiment was over, that a judgment was about to be rendered. "You've done something remarkable," he said quietly, addressing them both at once, his gaze moving between them like a measuring scale. "You've shown me that love, genuine love, can exist even in a world of absolute control. That hope doesn't need to be based in reality to be powerful. That two people from different worlds, separated by every conceivable boundary of class and power and station, can find something worth risking everything for." He stood from his chair, a movement that took longer than it should have, revealing the lingering weakness from his illness, and moved toward the window, looking out over the estate that spread beneath them like a kingdom in miniature. "I've spent the last 3 months watching you," he continued, his voice carrying the weight of observation and understanding. "I've seen how you look at each other when you think no one is watching. I've seen how you find ways to be together despite the risks. I've seen how you've managed to maintain your secret while the entire household whispers about it, while the other lords and ladies speculate, while the rumors spread like wildfire. You've been remarkably clever." He turned to face them again, and his expression was unreadable. "Which means that my original question has been answered," he said slowly. "I asked you to help me understand what happens when people begin to believe they have agency within a system designed to deny them that thing. And I have my answer. They become dangerous. Not to me, necessarily. My authority remains absolute, but dangerous to the system itself. Dangerous to the entire structure that depends on the assumption that power is immovable, that hierarchy is eternal, that resistance is futile." He walked toward them, his movements deliberate and measured, and Demon realized that this was the moment. This was when the judgment would come. This was when Lord Blackstone would decide whether to execute them, exile them, separate them, or some other punishment that would restore the natural order. "And now I must decide what to do with that knowledge," Lord Blackstone said, coming to stand directly in front of them. The silence that followed was absolute, because the final choice wasn't whether Demon and Catherine would be punished for their love. The final choice was whether Lord Blackstone would be willing to fundamentally transform the entire foundation of his power to let them live. And, more than that, the final choice would reveal whether love and agency and genuine human connection could actually exist within a world built on hierarchy and control, or whether they were illusions, beautiful and compelling, but ultimately futile against the machinery of power. The silence stretched between them like a living thing, breathing, waiting, demanding resolution. Lord Blackstone stood before them, his silhouette framed against the window, the light from the dying afternoon catching the sharp angles of his face. 3 months of observation had changed something in him. Not softened him, but perhaps clarified him, like a lens focusing light into a single point of burning intensity. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing toward the chairs arranged before his desk. They sat, Demon and Catherine side by side, their hands almost touching but not quite, maintaining the careful distance that propriety demanded even in this moment outside all propriety. The Lord moved behind his desk, not sitting, but standing with his hands braced against the wood as if drawing strength from it. "I have made a decision," Lord Blackstone began, his voice measured and deliberate. "But before I inform you of that decision, I need you to understand the context in which I'm making it." He moved to a portrait on the wall, a painting of a woman Demon had never seen before, though something in her features reminded him of the Lord himself. "My mother," Lord Blackstone said, his gaze fixed on the painting. "She died when I was 12 years old, not from illness or accident, but from what the physicians called melancholia. What we would now call despair. She was married to my father when she was 16 years old. She had never met him before the ceremony. She bore 5 children, 4 of whom died in infancy. She had no agency, no choice, no voice in any matter of significance." He turned back to face them. My father was not a cruel man. He was simply a man of his time, operating within the structures of power that had been handed down to him. He believed that women were meant to be vessels, that love was a luxury for the lower classes who had nothing else, that the highest purpose of a marriage was the production of heirs and the consolidation of alliances. The Lord's expression grew distant, as if he were seeing something far away in time. My mother took her own life when I was 15. She did it quietly, efficiently, with the kind of planning that suggested it wasn't an impulse but a choice she'd been contemplating for years. She left no note. She offered no explanation. She simply decided that the life she'd been given was unbearable, and she ended it. Catherine made a small sound. Not quite a gasp, but a recognition of sorrow. "I inherited my father's power," Lord Blackstone continued. "I inherited his wealth, his title, his authority, and I swore that I would be different, that I would maintain control more efficiently, that I would ensure that the people within my domain understood the rules and accepted them without question. I told myself that if people knew their place, accepted their place, understood that resistance was futile, then they wouldn't fall into despair, that they wouldn't seek escape through death or rebellion or any other means of dissolution." He moved back to the window, and his reflection in the glass looked like a ghost, a shadow of a man, rather than a man himself. "But I was wrong," he said softly. "I was profoundly, fundamentally wrong. Control without understanding, power without compassion, hierarchy without acknowledgement of the humanity within it. These things don't prevent despair. They create it. They cultivate it. They ensure it." He turned to face them fully, and his eyes were wet, not with tears, but with something like them, something that suggested emotion was threatening to break through the careful containment he'd built around himself. "When you broke your instructions, demon, when you chose truth over obedience, you did something I've never seen anyone do before. You acknowledged that another person's humanity mattered more than your own survival. And when you accepted that truth, Catherine, when you made a choice instead of simply accepting what was forced upon you, you did something I've never seen a woman in my household do before. You claimed your own agency." He moved back to his desk and pulled out a document, parchment sealed with wax, official and formal. "I have spent 3 months studying what happens when love is allowed to grow in the spaces between control. I have watched how it transforms people. I have measured how it threatens the structure of absolute power, and I have come to a conclusion that would have been unthinkable to my father, and would be considered madness by most of my peers." He held the document up, and the light caught the wax seal, making it gleam like a burning coal. "The structure of power as I've maintained it is unsustainable," Lord Blackstone said, and his voice carried the weight of a man making a confession that would alter everything. "Not because of external threats, but because of what grows within it. Because human beings are not meant to be objects. Because love, genuine love, is a force that cannot be controlled by hierarchies or fear or absolute authority." He broke the seal on the document with deliberate slowness, the red wax cracking beneath his hands. "Therefore, I am making changes. Significant changes. Changes that will likely be condemned by every other lord in this region, that will be seen as weakness, as madness, as a betrayal of everything our class has built." He unfolded the parchment and read aloud. "I, Lord Nathaniel Blackstone, in sound mind and of legal authority, do hereby declare the following. First, I grant freedom to Demon, formerly enslaved in my household, effective immediately. His servitude is ended. His debt to my house is forgiven. He is released from all obligations and restrictions that bind him to this estate or to me." Demon felt Catherine's hand find his, gripping it so tightly he thought his bones might break. "Second," the Lord continued, "I acknowledge that the marriage between myself and Lady Catherine was consummated under false pretenses. I acknowledge that the witnesses were deceived, that the contract was entered into dishonestly, and that by the laws of honorable men, such a marriage might be considered void." Catherine made a sound, something between a cry and a question. "However," Lord Blackstone said, raising his hand, "I also acknowledge that a true marriage, a real marriage, one based on genuine understanding and consent, has formed in the spaces between my authority. I therefore release Lady Catherine from her marriage to me, and I grant her the freedom to choose her own path." He set the document on his desk and looked directly at Damon. "You are free to leave this estate. You are free to go anywhere, to do anything, to become anyone you wish to become. No one will hunt you. No one will bring you back by force. I give you my word, and the word of a lord, however compromised it may be, is binding." Then he looked at Catherine. "And you are free to stay or go. You may remain here as a guest in my household, or you may leave with him, or you may make any other choice your heart desires. Your father's alliance with my house is secured by the marriage certificate and the witnesses. Legally, the contract stands. But in here—" He gestured vaguely toward his chest, toward the place where his heart would be. "In the part of me that is not, that ruled by power, I release you." He sat down heavily in his chair, and suddenly he looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with his recent illness. "But there is a condition," he said, and his voice had taken on a new tone, not demanding, but almost pleading. "There is always a condition, because I am still a man of power, and I cannot entirely escape the nature of what I am." He leaned forward, his elbows on his desk, his fingers steepled before his face. "I want you to understand something. Both of you. I'm not doing this out of pure altruism. I'm not suddenly transformed into some champion of freedom and agency. I'm doing this because I've realized that the kind of power I've been wielding is brittle. It breaks under the weight of genuine human connection. And I've realized that there might be a different kind of power, a power based not on control and fear, but on choice and understanding." He looked up at them, and his expression was raw in a way that suggested he was showing them something he'd never shown anyone before. "I'm doing this because I want to know what happens next. I want to know whether love can actually survive and thrive when given real freedom, or whether it only flourishes in the shadows because the darkness gives it a kind of meaning it would lose in the light. I want to know whether you, Demon, will choose to stay or leave. Whether you, Catherine, will choose him or safety or some other path I haven't imagined." He sat back in his chair, and the vulnerability faded slightly, replaced by something harder but not entirely impenetrable. "And I'm doing this because I suspect that if I don't, if I allow the old structures to continue, if I maintain my power through control and force, then one day you might do what my mother did. You might decide that the weight of captivity, even benevolent captivity, is too much to bear, and I cannot bear that thought." The silence that followed was different from the silence before. It was no longer the silence of waiting for judgment. It was the silence of standing at the edge of a precipice, looking out at a landscape that had suddenly become visible. "You don't have to answer now," Lord Blackstone said. "You have time. You have tonight and tomorrow and as long as you need. But by the end of the week, I will need to know, are you staying or leaving? And if you're staying, what does that mean? What does it look like? What does a household founded on something other than pure hierarchy actually become?" That night, for the first time since the wedding night, Demon and Catherine met openly. Not in the shadows. Not in stolen moments. Not with the careful distance that pretense demanded. They walked together through the gardens, their hands linked, their presence acknowledged and visible to anyone who cared to see. The servants stopped working when they passed, watching with expressions that ranged from shock to wonder to something like hope. "What will you do?" Catherine asked as they walked beneath the bare branches of the autumn trees. "I don't know," Demon admitted. He was no longer afraid to be honest. "I could leave. I could go anywhere now. Build a new life. become someone who isn't defined by servitude. But, Catherine prompted, because she could hear the unspoken hesitation in his voice. But I don't want to leave you, he said simply, even though I'm free to. Even though staying keeps me bound to this place in ways that aren't entirely legal, but are somehow more binding than law. Catherine stopped walking and turned to face him. In the fading light, her expression was serious and clear. I could leave with you, she said. We could go somewhere, anywhere. Start over as people without titles or status or power. But? Demon asked, echoing her question. But I'm not ready to be invisible again, Catherine said. And I think I'm starting to believe that maybe this place, with him, with the changes he's making, maybe it could become something different. Maybe it could become somewhere that people aren't invisible, where choice matters, where love is acknowledged instead of hidden. She reached out and took his hand, and in that gesture was a question and a choice and a commitment all at once. So, what if we stayed? She continued. What if we didn't run? What if we helped him build something different here? That's incredibly naive, Demon said, not unkindly. Power doesn't change because one man decides to be different. No, Catherine agreed. But maybe it changes when people stop accepting it as immovable. Maybe it changes when we stop running from it and instead try to transform it from within. Demon looked out at the estate stretched below them. The great house with its towers and walls, the servant quarters, the gardens and fields and forests that extended as far as the eye could see. For his entire life, he had seen it as a prison, but now, looking at it with Catherine, he began to see it differently. Not as a cage, but as a space that could be reshaped, reimagined, transformed. All right, he said finally. We'll stay. We'll see what happens. Catherine smiled, and the light from the setting sun caught her face, making her look like something almost ethereal. A woman caught between her old life and her new one, suspended in possibility. They walked back to the house as the darkness gathered around them, and neither of them spoke, but the silence between them was no longer heavy with secrets. It was light with understanding. When they reached the entrance to the house, they found Lord Blackstone waiting for them, standing in the doorway, watching their approach with an expression that was difficult to read. "You're staying," he said. It wasn't a question. "We're staying," Demon confirmed. Lord Blackstone nodded slowly, and something in his shoulders seemed to relax, as if he'd been holding tension there for days and could finally release it. "Good," he said, simply. "Then tomorrow, we begin. We begin the work of building something different, something that has never existed before in this world." He turned to go back inside, then paused and looked back at them. "My mother would have liked you both," he said quietly. "She would have liked knowing that love, real love, could exist in this world. She would have liked knowing that choice matters. She would have liked knowing that things can change." He disappeared into the house, and Demon and Catherine stood alone in the darkness, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on them, but also something else, a lightness, a sense of possibility, a feeling that perhaps the world was not as fixed and immovable as they'd always believed. In the weeks that followed, Lord Blackstone began to implement his vision. Servants were given wages for their labor. The markets for goods were open to fair trade practices. Education was provided to those who desired it, regardless of station. Decisions about the estate's management began to include voices beyond just the Lord's own. The other nobles laughed. They said he'd gone mad. They said his changes would destroy the very foundations of society. They predicted that his household would crumble into chaos. But they were wrong. What emerged from Lord Blackstone's estate was not chaos. It was something far more surprising. It was a kind of order that was based not on fear and control, but on understanding and mutual respect. It was imperfect and incomplete and constantly struggling against centuries of ingrained hierarchy, but it was real. Demon became the Lord's advisor, not through legal title but through genuine partnership. He helped design new systems for management and communication. Catherine became a patron of learning and education, working to ensure that knowledge, the true source of power, was distributed rather than hoarded. And Lord Blackstone himself became something that no lord in the region had ever been before. A man willing to question the very foundations of his power and to reshape those foundations based on understanding rather than control. It wasn't a happy ending in the conventional sense. It was messy and complicated and fraught with contradictions. The weight of centuries couldn't be lifted in weeks or months or years. There were setbacks and failures and moments when the old hierarchies reasserted themselves, but it was an ending where agency mattered, where choice was honored, where love, not as a luxury for the lower classes, not as a transaction between families, but as a genuine human connection, was acknowledged and celebrated. And perhaps most importantly, it was an ending where a slave boy who had spent his entire life invisible became visible, where a noblewoman who had been taught to accept her cage discovered she had the right to refuse it, and where a lord who had inherited absolute power chose instead to share it. The title had promised something impossible. The virgin slave boy was forced to take the master's place on the wedding night. And the boot had been this. But what if, in that moment of violation and deception, two people discovered that the most revolutionary act in a world built on hierarchy and control was simply to treat each other as human beings? What if the greatest power wasn't power itself, but the willingness to surrender it? What if love, genuine, terrifying, transformative love, could actually change the world? Not entirely, not immediately, not without cost, but enough to matter, enough to make the impossible seem, for the first time, like it might actually be possible after all.